and he'll address them after he speaks. So I want to welcome all of you and Mr. Fulton, who is the director of Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research. He's a former mayor of Ventura, California, and director of planning and economic development for the city of San Diego. And I want to interject that he has written an article about Ventura, California, which is very interesting. Maybe he'd like to share it with you. Since arriving at the Kinder Institute in 2014, Mr. Fulton has overseen a tripling of the Institute's size and budget. He is the author of 6 books, including Guide to the California Planning, the Standard Urban Planning Textbook in California, and The Reluctant Metropolis. The Politics of Urban Growth in Los Angeles, which was an LA Times bestseller. His most recent book is Talk City, a chronicle of political life in an all-American town. He currently serves as board chair for Metro Lab Network, a national network of research partnerships between cities and universities, and vice chair of Link Houston, a transportation equity advocacy group. Fulton holds master's degrees in mass communication from the American University and urban planning from the University of California, Los Angeles. So, and now I introduce to you Mr. Bill Fulton.
Fuller.
Thanks, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to share my screen so I can do my PowerPoint. Hopefully you can all see this. I have to get this into the right spot here. Hold on a sec. There we go. There we go. Yeah, Bill Fulton here. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. The one thing I didn't include in the bio, which you read from, is that I am a proud congregant of Congregation Emanu, and I'm happy to be affiliated with the temple. I was asked to talk about how COVID is going to affect Houston. I tend to think about cities writ large. I'm an urban planner, and so I'm going to talk about cities and what cities are like and how they're shaped, and what we're going to see that's different when coming out of COVID. This will be we will see you'll see a lot of examples from Houston, and I can speak more specifically about Houston in the Q&A. And again, as was said, if you have a question for me, just put it in the chat, and then I guess the moderators will ask the questions, right? You know, as I say, I'm an urban planner, and I think about cities a lot. And one of the things that is characteristic about cities such as Houston, although Houston doesn't always look quite this dense, right? This is more like a New York or a Hong Kong type density. But the whole idea of cities, including Houston, is that people are in close proximity to one another. They can get to see each other easily, talk to each other easily, and that creates efficiencies for the economy and also efficiencies, frankly, for social interaction as well. In other words, density is the very essence of a city. But obviously, in COVID, that's as is evidenced by the format here tonight. We're not down at Congregation Emanu talking in person. We're all on Zoom, and people are afraid of density right now, and with good reason. So we can't
Welcome to Alltech Lansing.
We can't do the usual things we do in cities right now. And a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe people won't want to live in cities so much. Maybe cities won't be so important. A place like Central Houston, where many of us live and work, won't be as important. It'll deteriorate. Same thing with New York and San Francisco, which are seeing a lot of flight of people out of the city. I'll get to that. But I want to say, you know, so then the question is Houston going to become a less compelling city, and are cities generally over? Or will they just evolve?
That's right.
Again, if you could all mute yourselves so that while I'm talking, and then we'll move on later. But I gotta say, you know, cities have been around for thousands of years, They've survived floods and pandemics and wars. And believe it or not, during all this time, they've only gotten bigger and more important over time. One of the most important pandemics we ever saw in world history was the cholera epidemic in London in the 1850s. That completely flattened the city. Thousands of people died. Once the pandemic was over, the population of the city doubled. So the mere fact that we're having a pandemic and people are concerned about density and human proximity to one another does not mean the end of cities. So how will cities be different when this is all over? And perhaps more important is, how in the world is this gal going to drink her drink with her mask on? I think that's one of the biggest questions I've had throughout. I don't really know the answer to how you do that. Well, so right now, we're going to see more people engaged in remote work. That's pretty obvious, right? Here we are, we're all probably at home. I'm in my spare bedroom right now, which is part of the reason that I have the picture of Lovett Hall behind me, so you don't see what my spare bedroom looks like. And something like right now, half of all office workers in the United States are working at home. That's gradually declining. Some people are going back to the office, but very, very slowly. So, but half of all US office workers are in the office, half are at home. So the biggest question that we have about cities and about life after COVID is this going to continue at this level? Because I think a lot of businesses, a lot of corporations that have been resistant to let people work remotely have seen that it does kind of work. Well, interestingly enough, companies are still paying their rent on their office space. Companies are still paying their rent on their office space. Large corporations have not given up their office space. Office absorption, this is a nerdy chart from the real estate industry, but it shows you that the amount of office space being absorbed in the Houston market, that's the black line. It's gone down, but it's gone down in 2020, but not in a significantly different way than before. So the amount of office space that's leased goes up and down. It's gone down in 2020 here in Houston, but it hasn't gone down a lot more than we would expect. So I think in the end, my best guess is that most people will go back to work at least some of the time. And what people are telling me is that they guess that probably on average, office workers will go back to work 3 or 4 days a week. A few might go to work less often, but generally speaking, 3 to 4 days a week. And so what does that mean? That means that office space will probably be off by around 10%. And we'll see fewer long-term office leases and more short-term office leases. So one of the questions is, how do people's behavior change if they don't have to go to the office every day? Will businesses really be willing to allow office workers to go to work 1 or 2 days a week instead of 3 or 4? That's a huge difference between 1 and 2 and 3 or 4, right? A big question is, what's going to happen to these very dense business districts like downtown Houston, like the Galleria area, sometimes known as Uptown, the Med Center, the Energy Corridor. All of these are very, very dense office districts with lots and lots of employees. What's going to happen? Well, I would suggest to you that what's going to happen is that your business district is a place you will go when you need to have meetings. And I can imagine in my own life, probably what I'll do is I'll stay at home when I need to do my individual work. I'm not going to commute to the office just to type on the computer. But when I go to campus or when I go to another place such as downtown, it'll be because I need to have meetings. So more and more we will see people working at home to do their individual work, and then convening in business districts and other central locations to have meetings. That will, among other things, affect transportation, right? It should ease up a little bit, at least, rush hour traffic. We've seen that a little bit. Rush hour traffic has come back, but it's not what it was before, and I'm not sure it ever will be. So we'll see most people go back to work probably 3 or 4 days a week at least. I think it'll be the rare person who only goes to work goes to the office 1 or 2 days a week. We will see, as office space declines, we will see more office space in a place like downtown Houston converted to residential use. We are already seeing more apartment buildings and condominium buildings being built in downtown Houston, and we are seeing more old office buildings converted to residential use. So as this excess office space becomes available, I think you'll see people who want to live in the city will do so. That's counterintuitive to what I'm going to say in a minute, but I just wanted to put that out there. Then the other big question is what's going to happen now that we're ordering everything from Amazon, and instead of us going to the store, the Amazon delivery truck comes to our house, right? Or in my case, sometimes 3 or 4 houses, 3 or 4 times a day. What is called bricks and mortar retail, that is to say, retail stores that are actually in a physical location are built, will probably continue to decline. And we'll see a lot of strip shopping centers all over the city in the near future look like this. They're going to look like this because obviously many restaurants and bars are going to go out of business. I'll come back to that in a minute. And many, because I think there's a difference between restaurants and retail stores, and many retail stores will go out of business, probably permanently. We've already seen J. Crew and a number of retail chains go bankrupt as a result of COVID. And I think we're going to see that kind of thing happen more and more. This is to give you a contrast to that other nerdy real estate chart I showed you. This is the amount of retail space that has been leased on a net basis in Houston in the last few years. And you can see that for the last 10 years, no matter what the economic conditions were, the amount of real estate, the amount of retail space in Houston that was leased went up every single quarter for 10 years, no matter what economic conditions were. And then in the second quarter of 2020, that's April, May, June, the amount of retail space that was leased on a net basis went down by 1 million square feet. So we are seeing a precipitous drop in retail space. That's going to really change our neighborhoods. It's going to change our shopping centers. It's going to change our neighborhood retail strip malls. And what's going to happen? We're going to have, as I say, we're going to have fewer regular retail stores. You'll still have Walmart. You'll still have Walgreens. You'll still have CVS. You'll still have a lot of high-end stores in the Galleria. But a lot of the ordinary day-to-day retail stores that you see in your strip shopping center, they're going to go away because they simply are not. They're going to go out of business in the COVID crisis, and they're not going to be able to come back. And more people are switching to online shopping anyway. What's going to take the place of these businesses? Well, yoga studios, personal care stores, shops, hair salons, nail salons, all those things are growing, and you're going to see fewer retail stores and more of these personal care businesses. You're also going to see, I think, well, you see the WeWork sign there. I think you're also going to see more what is sometimes called co-working spaces. So maybe I don't want to or need to go to the office downtown every day, but for some reason I can't work at home, right? So maybe I make a deal with my employer where I go to into a local retail center where there's a little office that I share with other people near my house, so they don't have to commute. And lastly, you see a picture of a restaurant currently empty, right? But I do think that even in the short run, restaurants and bars are going to take it on the chin. We're going to see a lot of them go out of business because they're really struggling at this 50, 75, and 50% capacity. But in the long run, we've seen a long-term pattern toward restaurants and bars becoming more popular. And I think eventually they will come back and they will become even more popular than ever for several reasons. One is retail space in your local shopping center will be cheaper than ever because there will be a lot of vacancies. But the other one is that people are dying to go out and be together in restaurants and bars. They're just dying to. And this is one of the first things that's going to come back. So we're going to see a permanent decline in retail space. We will see retail spaces used in different ways. We'll see bars and restaurants eventually hollow out and come back. And so there's been a lot of discussion about, okay, aren't people going to move away from the cities, or at least move away from the big cities? And the answer is, what you see here is a map of out-migration and in-migration of where people are moving from and to, according to U-Haul. And what we're seeing is that particularly in New York and San Francisco, we are seeing a large number of people fleeing those are very expensive, very crowded places. And we are seeing a lot of people flee those places completely and move to other smaller cities or cities in other parts of the country. As you see here, the green is where people are moving to. People are still moving to cities in Texas, people from the coast. You see that more and more. But you also see people moving to smaller cities from New York and San Francisco and places like that. So, for example, the big winners, particularly in the West, from where people moving from San Francisco, are high amenity locations in the Intermountain West, such as Boise, Idaho, which is on the right, and Bend, Oregon is on the left. And actually, my own daughter and her family are moving from Berkeley in the Bay Area to Bend, Oregon. They're leaving Friday. They've decided that the Bay Area is too expensive and just too much of a hassle for them to stay there. But if you go back and look at this chart, you see, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Go back into this chart, you'll see people aren't doing that in Texas. Now, they may be moving further out, and I'll get to that in a minute. But people are not leaving Texas or big cities in Texas. They are actually moving to Texas and to other places, mostly from New York and San Francisco, a little bit LA too. But New York, San Francisco, and LA are the places that people are leaving more than anywhere else. So then the question becomes, if you stay in Houston, right, but you're working at home, which maybe you didn't plan on when you bought your house, where are you going to live? What are people going to do? Right. What kind of a lifestyle are you going to choose? Are you going to want to live in the city, or are you going to want to live out in the suburbs? Now, a lot of people are saying, and there is some evidence for this, that particularly people who work at home, are generally moving out of the city into the suburbs where they can find bigger houses because they want more space because they're working at home. You especially see this in, like I say, places like New York. People are leaving Manhattan, for example, and Brooklyn, and moving to New Jersey or Westchester County, where they can buy a bigger house for the same price and get more living space and have more space to work at home. I think in the short run, you're going to see that in every city, including Houston. I think you'll see people who need more space because they're working at home or because their kids are on top of them, want to move further out where they can get a bigger house. But I don't think that that's going to be a long-term trend. I think the long-term trend is going to be somewhat different. Now, every year, some of you may have heard of the Kinder Houston Area Survey. Professor Kleinberg does this survey. Many of you have seen him give his presentation. Every year, Dr. Kleinberg asks a question. He asks, would you rather live in a larger single-family home out in the suburbs where you have to drive everywhere? These are people in Harris County. Or would you rather live closer into the city in a smaller house where you can walk to places? And believe it or not, the answer to that every year, year after year, is just about 50-50. About half the people want to live in bigger houses in the suburbs where they have to drive, and about half the people want to live closer in, and they're willing to take a smaller house if they can live closer to places and walk to places. Now, that may change somewhat because of COVID, right? But I think the overall trend is not going to change. And so in the long run, we're going to see, I think, cities and suburbs will both come back. And a lot of people have said, well, if you don't have to drive to work every day, of course you're going to move further out into the suburbs so you can get a bigger house and a bigger lot. And I think my response to that is that that's not quite right. I think what's more accurate is that people who are no longer tied to their commute are going to be willing to, are going to want to live, you will be able to live where they really want to live. And for some people that will be, like the picture on the left, in a larger house out in the suburbs on a larger lot. But for a lot of people, and there's a caveat here, which I'll get to in a minute, that may look more like the scene on the left, which we see increasingly in Houston in different developments, particularly inside the Loop, where people may live in an apartment or a condominium or a high rise, but they can walk to places. They're not tethered to their car all the time, and everything is very convenient to them. Now, there's a caveat there, which is in the short run, people are kind of scared of being close to one another, right? So I would not expect to see this. That's why I said in the short term, the suburbs win and the cities lose, because we're going to see a lot of people. It's going to take people a long time to feel comfortable coming back, being together, being in bars, being in restaurants, walking down the street right next to each other, and so on and so forth. But in the long run, I think what this will do, particularly if all of us don't have to commute every day, is it will free us more than it has in the past to live the lives we want to live. Now, there's a lot of other changes that are going to take place, right? I think a lot of the separation and people will work. A lot of those separators, those plexiglass separators and so forth in restaurants and in retail stores and in drugstores, those will stay, right? Those are not going to go away. You'll have those forever. And increasingly, I think people will, in crowded places like airports, feel comfortable wearing masks. You go to Asia, everybody wears a mask at the airport, or everybody wears a mask in a crowded location. I think you'll see that more and more in the US, but those are more like behavioral changes, individual day-to-day behavioral changes. So as I say, in the long run, cities will be different. Houston will be different. It will survive. It'll become both more suburban and more urban at the same time, I guess you might say. So that's what I think will happen. I'm going to give up the screen right now so that we can go back. So we can go back to questions, and I can hear what you have to say, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Bill Fulton has stopped screen share.
Do you want me to answer the questions off of the? Oh, these are all mute. If anybody has a question, please just put it in the chat box. Or you're all too stunned to say anything. We have a great turnout tonight. We have 75 or so people. That's terrific. I'd be interested to know how your own life is changing. Who are the people? Here's a good question. Who are the people who are moving? Are they only quite well-off people? Yes. In general, the answer to that question is yes. Thank you, Leo. I do think that it's people with more resources who are either moving or buying second homes. From the conversations I've had with people who deal with wealthy people, a lot of them, if they own a second home, they spent all summer there. If they don't own a second home, they've gone and bought one. So yes, in general, these are more well-off people. A couple of questions about schools. Do you see families with and without children making different choices? Yes, we saw that already. People without children were more likely to want to live in cities and want to live in apartments and condominiums. We saw that before. But I would make a point that is sometimes overlooked, which is only about one in every, most households do not have children at home. We think that everything is driven by what we want to do for our kids, but only about one out of every 3 or 4 households has children at home. So that's less of a driver than you might think. How will schools be impacted? That's a really good question. My wife is a special ed teacher in Pasadena ISD. She's currently trying to deal with autistic kids both in person and online. I think what and that's she's really struggling with that. I think the lesson we've learned from K-12 education is, particularly for younger kids, online learning doesn't work, right? The older the kids get, the easier it is. Our daughter's in college at A&M and she's doing fine. The kids at Rice are doing fine. I think a lot of high school kids do fine. Oh, there's a lot of questions coming in now. This is great. I'm just going to keep going down and I'm just going to keep going down and answering the questions as I can. So I think in the long run, we will see school, there'll be tremendous pressure to have school in person. It may well be that we have to create more distance between the kids. That's hard to do with little kids. That's, physical distancing, social distancing with it has been very, very difficult. How do I think this will affect Houston Metro short-term and long-term? Houston Metro is, of course, the transit agency that runs all the trains and the buses. Transit agencies have been clobbered by this whole thing for several reasons. One is their ridership is way down because people are afraid to get, first of all, number one, a lot of people aren't going to work, they're working at home. Number two, they're afraid to get on the bus or the train. I ride the bus and the train a lot, and so I'm on Metro's mailing list, and Metro's really good about sending out emails. They say whenever employees get COVID, they actually send out an email. So in the short term, Houston Metro, like all transit agencies, are getting whacked. Another problem is that many transit agencies, such as Houston Metro, are financed by sales tax. So the less retail sales we have, the less money Houston Metro and other transit agencies have. It's a huge problem. They're probably going to have to cut back their service more or less permanently to get out of this. And for those of you who read the New York Times, there's a giant story in the New York Times about this topic today. Are real estate prices holding in Houston? Is there a difference between single family and high rise? This is a complicated question in Houston compared to other places because we are affected by the oil and gas downturn. Real estate prices in Houston are down already because of the oil and gas downturn. And generally speaking, in cities around the country, especially the expensive coastal cities like San Francisco and New York, there's a big difference in prices between the high rises in the central part of the city and single family homes in the suburbs. The suburbs are doing better. I don't think that's as much the case in Houston because we don't have as much density and we don't have as much high rise development. So I think the difference is not as great here as it is elsewhere. Wow, a lot of great questions. I hope I can get to that. I'm just going to keep going, all right? The technology companies are allowing their employees to live away from the office, but at the same time, they say creativity goes away without personal interface. Yes, I agree with this. I'm really worried about this myself. My son-in-law, I told you that my daughter and her family is moving from Berkeley to Bend, Oregon. My son-in-law is a software engineer at Facebook, and they're letting him work remotely until next July. I think this could have I think this is one of the reasons why people will go back to the office, not just because they like a personal interaction, but because personal interaction is necessary for real connection in order to move things along in business, particularly in technology. And as we see, for example, many of you may be familiar with the fact that the Rice is renovating the old Sears building in Midtown, the one right on Main and Wheeler, to become a tech hub, right? You may have seen that. That's been under construction the last couple of years. That's based on the assumption that people have to come together to be creative and to innovate in business. Certainly, the whole idea of Rice of the university and the research at the medical center is the same kind of thing. How is Rice planning for the near future and long term? Well, that's a good question. Rice has made it very clear that they will well, two things. I'll answer this question two different ways. Rice has done a good job of being able to bring some students back and do it successfully without much in the way of COVID infection. So something like half the students are on campus. Everybody gets tested all the time. I've been tested 6 times since August. And so Rice, and in addition, as you may have seen either on campus or in the paper, Rice has built several temporary buildings, the purpose of which is to provide more space to spread people out. Now in the spring semester, I think Rice is going to, let me just back up and say, for people like me and my office, we don't interact much with the students. We're a research entity. We're just basically consume office space on the campus. Rice has discouraged us from going back to the office. And currently, I have a staff of 30 people, and only about 3 of them are ever in the office at any given time. And I think Rice is going to want to continue to do that. In the long term, it'll be really interesting to see whether, this is in answer to a number of questions, but in the long run, it'll be interesting to see whether people permanently spread out more or want to spread out more. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in the long run, Rice and other universities have smaller classes in larger spaces. So I don't know how many of you have been on campus lately and seen those 4 temporary buildings that have been constructed over sort of on the Main Street side of the campus near the residential dorms. I wouldn't be surprised if those stay there permanently. And Rice semi-permanently has what they're called dual platform instruction, where you provide the instruction both online and in person, and fewer students come to class. A big question in higher education is, okay, if you're doing classes online, what are you paying for, right? Why are you paying 50 grand a year if all you're doing is sitting at home with your parents Zooming into classes? That's a big question. There are a number of other questions here which are kind of, some of them have been, some of them are sort of similar to one another. I'm going to try to consolidate these here. Claire asks, in office space, will people stay spaced as they are now? I think the answer to that is no. One of the things, if you have worked in an office setting for a long time, as I have, one of the things you've noticed is the amount of space that you get as an office worker has shrunk over time, right? When I started working, an office worker used to get about 300 square feet of space. That would be about a 15 by 20 space, right? Now it's about 150 square feet, about half as much, about a 10 by 15 space, just basically a cubicle. So over time, in order to save money and increase the efficiency of office space, companies have shrunk the amount of office space available to any individual employee. I think that's going to get reversed now. And we're going to see more space for each individual. And I think that's going to be permanent. But I think we're going to see more and more people commuting, working at home part of the time, commuting to work somewhere between 2 and 4 days a week. And increasingly, what companies are talking about is even doing away with the idea of a separate office or, your own individual office or cubicle. You work at home on your laptop, you come home, you come into the office, you have a little cubicle, you plug your laptop in. That's not yours all the time. That's not your office. So I think we will see those 2 trends. Number one is there will be more, people will be spread out more in offices. But secondly, they won't be coming every day, and so they won't have their own proprietary office space. They'll move around. If downtown doesn't come back, people still move there? Well, that's Barbara Mandelstein. That's a difficult question, Barbara. Traditionally, downtown Houston, even more than other downtowns, was an office location, right? This goes to another question from Ben Klein here in a minute. Downtown Houston has already seen a decline or a stagnation in the office space there as companies have moved out of downtown to other office locations. So BP is now in the energy corridor. You all know that ExxonMobil built their own new big headquarters out in Spring near the Woodlands. So many companies have already left downtown. What's been happening instead is that you've seen more bars and restaurants go in, more arts and cultural attractions go in. That goes to Ben's question, which I'll get to in a minute, and sort of more lifestyle stuff, and some office buildings translated to residential. If downtown does not come back as an office location, I think people will still continue to move there because the other things that are important to them will be there. If those other things suffer, and particularly our performance art, which I want to talk about in response to Ben Klein's question, that could affect people's willingness to live downtown, because part of the attraction of living downtown is the close proximity to. I don't live in downtown. We live in Midtown. We live very close to downtown, just on the other side of the freeway. Proximity to the cultural events and to the sports stadiums is a tremendous attraction to us. We're only blocks away from that. If those things don't come back, we're in big trouble. Ben Klein asked, and I'm skipping around, I'm not answering these questions in order so that I can kind of group them. Ben Klein said, how do you see this affecting the arts, both performance and non-performance? Well, performing arts have taken a huge hit. There have basically been no live performances, or very few live performances, since March. So I think one of the things that's going to happen permanently is that performing arts will also go dual platform, right? I think one of the things that arts organizations are realizing is that they can reach a wider audience online if they do it right. Everybody so just to give you an example, which is not Houston specific, everybody in the country has been wanting to see the Hamilton musical, right? For which you have to go to New York and pay $300 a ticket. But during the pandemic, it showed up on the TV, right? And a lot of people watched it. I think, and the reason arts organizations have not wanted to do that is because they believe their fundraising is related to high touch live, being in the live performances that you go to. But if they can continue to maintain fundraising from their patrons and from the people who like their work, even while providing some performances online, I think that you'll see more and more arts organizations. I would guess especially smaller and more nimble ones, focus more on online as well as in-person performances. I'm going to come back. Sylvia Brody asked, how will this affect real estate taxes? Well, real estate taxes are affected mostly by whether your property value goes up or down, right? I think in the short, but property values don't rise and fall as rapidly as, say, retail sales. So I don't think it's going to have a big impact in the long run, in the short run. It is possible that if let's say, let me back up. A lot of real estate taxes, property tax revenue comes from offices and retail spaces. It is possible that if those spaces are not, well, if those spaces are, it is possible that if those spaces are vacant and those property values go down and the property taxes that result from those go down, it's possible that the city or the county might want to raise your property tax rates a little bit, but they are highly, this is unrelated to COVID, but the state legislature has basically restricted the ability of the city and the county to raise property tax rates. So if your property taxes go up, it's going to be because your property values are going up, not because the tax rates are going up. It's possible that I don't think residential values are going to go down though. So I think the property taxes will probably stay more or less the same. I'm going to skip over Aaron Regberg's question about I-45 so I can talk, for the moment, I'll come back to it so I can talk more about some of the questions that are more directly focused on COVID. So Jessica Mantell says, my husband's business has multiple locations across the country. They have announced that they are consolidating support services. For example, you no longer have a secretary at your location, but will be supported remotely. the company has chosen Houston as the location for consolidating their support staff. Do you think other companies will do something similar? And if so, will cities like Houston and Dallas with an educated workforce, office space outside of downtown, and a lower cost of living, allowing for lower salaries, benefit from this trend? Oh, I think it's very clear that the answer to that question is yes. And the best example that we saw recently, just in the last week or two, was the decision by Hewlett Packard Enterprise, which is one of the two major Hewlett Packard companies, to move the headquarters of its company from Silicon Valley to Spring. The idea that a tech company would move its headquarters from Silicon Valley to Houston was unimaginable a few years ago, but it's exactly for this reason. So I think Houston and Dallas, both very prosperous, very big, very successful cities, metro areas, with a lower cost of living, will definitely benefit from this flight from New York and San Francisco especially, and to a lesser extent from LA. Paul Lynn asks, will more affordable and workforce housing be created? Hard to know. In other parts of the country, affordable and workforce housing are often created with subsidies, government subsidies. In Texas, and especially in Houston, that hasn't been the case. So I think it's a little hard to say. As I said in answer to a previous question, the people moving further out tend to be higher income, right? And so I'm not sure this has an effect one way or the other on affordable and workforce housing. Let me go through and answer the other COVID-related questions, and then I'll come back. Roberta Harris says, how do you see the cultural aspect of Houston being changed? I think I sort of answered that question by saying that I think you'll see a lot more online performances. I think the biggest problem, the biggest difficulty that arts and cultural institutions will face, as many activities will face, including sports, for example, is the reluctance of people to gather, even after we begin to get vaccinated, right? Which will probably happen sometime in the spring and on into the summer. People are still going to be nervous about getting together. I mean, let's say we get to the point where 70% of the population is vaccinated by June, okay? Which is something that people are talking about. In theory, we should be all safe by then. Are you really going to go to Minute Maid with 50,000 other people or 40,000 other people to watch the Astros play? I'm not sure people are going to be comfortable doing that in 2021, maybe not even in 2022. So I think the big issue is going to, for arts and culture organizations is how do you reach your audience without bringing your audience literally into your space? You know, I toured the brand new Nancy and Rich Kinder building at the MFA the other day. Fabulous building designed by Stephen Hall from New York. It's a really fabulous building, and I would encourage you to go there. And the art is pretty spectacular too. But they really have to meter who goes in and out. They can't. It's a little like, I was over by Trader Joe's yesterday on Shepherd, and there's a long line of people waiting to get in. Well, I think you'll see the same thing at a place like the MFA, right? Even though it's a bigger space. Movie theaters. Barbara Mandelstein asked about movie theaters. Man, I don't know. I'm from LA, right? I think, I don't know what's going to happen to movie theaters. I have a hard time imagining movie theaters are ever going to be the same. What movie theaters are going to have to do is what high-end malls do, which is, instead of just showing a movie, they're going to have to provide an entire experience revolving around the movie. So I think this trend toward having a restaurant in the movie theater where you get to drink a drink and eat dinner while you're watching the movie, that kind of thing will become more common. But I would guess that the movie theater industry will never be as big now as it was before. Oh, I see. Aaron Regberg. Given the massive decrease in commuting due to the pandemic, do you think planned freeway expansions on like I-45 are still justifiable if they ever were? Well, I think I'll pass on the big question of whether or not they were ever justifiable. What happens when, so we're going to see a bit of a decline in we're going to see I'm not sure we're going to see a massive permanent decline in rush hour traffic. We might see a decline of 10 or 15%. What we tend to see when people don't go to work is they make different driving trips during the day, more local trips to go run errands and things like that. They don't tend to go on long trips on the freeway. So I do think that some of the pressure to increase, to expand the freeways will be off. I think trying to persuade text out of that is going to be really hard. And it's a really good point that lower rush hour traffic volumes as a result of COVID are going to run into the plans of TxDOT to expand I-45 and into a whole big controversy about whether I-45 should be expanded. But I don't think there's going to be such an enormous decrease in rush hour commuting. I mean, there was in the spring, but you go out now and it's not as bad as it was, but it's still bad. I don't think that's gonna change. I'm gonna skip around here back to other questions. Saran Kasberg asks, how will medical care change? Currently, there are a lot of telehealth visits. Yeah, I think that's permanent. I think that's permanent. And another thing I think is permanent is stuff like this. One of the interesting things that we do at the Kinder Institute is that we bring in speakers to speak about urban cities and urban issues from around the country. And typically we have 3 or 4 a year. They come in, we have a speech, they give a lecture at Brown Auditorium at the MFA. We get maybe 300 people, 250 people come. And it's expensive. We fly them in, we put them up in a hotel. Now we're doing all this online and we're getting more people watching these lectures than ever. So I think a lot of this online stuff is going to continue. And one of the big questions, I think, is how much of it will stick. And I think telemedicine is going to stick a lot. I think there are certain kinds of telehealth visits that are well suited for online, certain that aren't. I mean, a mental health or psychological visit, I think, is harder to do with telehealth. But just simply conveying a diagnosis and consulting with your general practitioner probably fine. What parts of the city are seeing high eviction rates? Well, not surprising. Well, first of all, there's a freeze on evictions right now, so nobody. But you know, there are certain parts of the city, and I think of Southwest Houston, I think of Northeast Houston, I think of Greenspoint, places like that, that have a lot of relatively low-cost apartments, and that's where a lot of low-wage workers live. Those folks are probably not paying their rent now, a lot of them, and not being evicted. Sooner or later, they're going to have to pay their rent or make a deal with their landlord. And I think one of the big issues coming is what's going to happen when evictions return and people can't pay their back rent. This is a growing housing crisis. You know, the city created a rental assistance fund of $20 million, mostly out of federal money, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of back rent people owe, right? So I think that there's going to be, there's an enormous housing crisis coming. And Charlotte Berkowitz asked a similar question, what do you foresee for the homeless? What I foresee is more of them. I think you're going to see a lot of people who have jobs or had jobs who will not be able to pay their rent, and they're going to have to live, and they'll be living in their cars. They're going to be, they might have a job, they might not. This is an enormous problem. And the question of evictions, homelessness, and crime, I would focus on evictions and homelessness here. How will our city recover from these increased issues? And I think the answer to that question is slowly. I don't know. My biggest concern about coming out of COVID in the recovery, as I said, is what happens to people who are at risk of being evicted or otherwise losing their housing. The number of people at risk is enormous. It's probably in the hundreds of thousands just in Houston. It's not a problem that is typical. I mean, it is a problem that's typical in every large city. And I wish I had an answer as to what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the politicians to continue the freeze on evictions for as long as possible. But of course, there's no rent relief. You know, you're not paying your rent, you're not going to get evicted, but you're also building the amount of rent you owe is piling up, right? And there'll be another federal bailout, which will help because that will provide some more money. The city got $400 million this year. But the scope of this, I think it's just going to be a massive, in the rental housing business, it's going to be a massive restructuring where a lot of people, a lot of investors who own apartment buildings are going to have to take less money from their tenants in order to avoid major homelessness. And that's just going to have to be something that gets worked through. I think those are all of the questions that I have gotten so far. Valerie, were there other questions that I missed that I should answer?
Thank you.
I didn't see any
I
more.
saw that.
Here, take a couple, please.
Let me see.
Yeah, it looks like I answered all the questions. I think the questions highlight some really good points about how people are anxious about the future right now. As you probably saw in the paper, job growth did not grow as much last month as everybody thought it was going to. There probably will be some kind of a recession. The possibility of more homeless people is considerable, and it's a pretty overwhelming situation. I talked in my talk mostly about the long-term implications, but the short-term implications are pretty considerable.
Okay, anyone else have any other questions or comments? Please submit them.
I appreciate the opportunity. 70 people still here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all and hear from you all. This is really great.
Well,
have a
we
comment.
really appreciate you and your giving your time to Emanu Sisterhood. We want to thank you so much again for giving us your time and explaining all of this to us. If no one else has any more questions, I would like to make two other comments. We have a Sisterhood program December 17th. A local artist, Ellen Orzak, will be speaking on Jewish women who are artists. January 11th at 5:30, we're having a special hands-on empanada program. So you'll get your ingredients and you make empanadas with the speaker. But in the meantime, thanks again, Mr. Fulton. I enjoy reading your essays that you've sent out. And if anyone else is interested, I'm sure you'd make those available.
Yes.
To other people.
Yes. Just if anybody wants to contact me and ask me another question or be on the mailing list for the essays I write, just email me at bfulton@rice.edu. bfulton@rice.edu. Okay.
Really
All right.
interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.